right, welcome to GRCC's Race, Ethnicity, and Identity Conference. I'm Lisa Glegg, and I'm a faculty member in the Social Science Department. And it's my pleasure to introduce a GRCC alumni today, Dr. Bob Hendershot, who teaches at GRCC. He teaches history here. He also has a very long CV full of good things. He has his associates from GRCC, and then he's got his bachelor's from MSU and his master's and PhD from Central Michigan University and the University of Strathclyde, Glasgow. So he's also the director of our Irish Studies program, and has a long list of publications and courses taught at GRCC. So I think we will learn a lot from him today. Please welcome.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Glegg, for that lovely intro. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you today to talk about a very important topic. The title of the talk is Idlewild's Rapture, Race, Power, and Culture in America's Black Eden. And this is an interesting thing to explore on a lot of different levels. It's of course one of the premier African-American resort communities in the United States, and its history is very much a history of America in the 20th century. So what I would like to do is share a couple of thoughts and go through some themes of the period, and then look at Idlewild in particular. And then I would like to have a larger conversation with all of you about, of course, the burning question for all historians is what is the historical significance of this or that thing? And the Idlewild community is an important part of that. You know, how can we place it in its historical significance, and how can we discuss that? So I've got a couple of ideas, but I'd also like to have that conversation with you. This is an interest that I've had for a while, but even though I grew up in Michigan, I did not, as a child, I did not know that Idlewild ever existed growing up here on the west side of GR. But it was not until I was in graduate school that I learned about it for the first time, and that's when I was doing my master's up at Central Michigan University there in Mount Pleasant. And during the summer semester, I got a student worker position at the archive up there, called the Clark Historical Archive. And the director put me to work writing 10-minute radio scripts for National Public Radio. And that's what I did all summer, and then he would read them through the local NPR affiliate. And it had some wacky name like Stories from Michigan's Attic or something like that. But I got some freedom to explore Michigan history and elements of it that I liked. And anyway, I got to prowl in the archives, you know, there at the Clark during the day, and then write these scripts. And one of the things that I stumbled onto was Idlewild. And I was instantly fascinated because the uniqueness and the significance of it just sort of did jump immediately. And I thought, how is it possible that I didn't know anything about this, you know, until I was 22 years old? And that was a question that's kind of stuck with me. Anyway, so I wrote the radio script, and we ran the 10-minute spot, and then I had to move on to other radio scripts, but I always remained interested in it. And about a decade ago, there was a flurry of scholarly interest in Idlewild, and there were some interesting books written, and I'll mention them, of course, as we go on. But what I wanted to do today was to place Idlewild in its historical context, and then talk with you about its historical significance. Idlewild, the city, the community, is located in a very remote spot in northern Michigan, in what's called Lake County, as you can see here. And it's sort of right smack in the middle of Lake County, which is nice because it's in, you know, the upper part of the lower peninsula. And of course, there are vast pine forests, and there are lovely lakes, and it's a nice enough area, I suppose. But really, given the beauty of Michigan at large, it's unremarkable in many ways. It's not on the coast. It's not part of the Sleeping Bear Dunes. It doesn't have something like Mackinac Island, right, to draw people. But even though it's remote, it did have a particular destiny and a role to play in a larger American, even global story, right, as an African-American resort community. During the era of segregation, which was, as you know, a very long time in the history of America, Black Americans were not welcome at most vacation locations. But several Michigan business people, a series of husband and wife, pairs, they detected that there was a market, right, an untapped market for a black resort, and that resort became Idlewild. And it was begun in 1912. That's when they first plotted the territory. So 100 years ago. It's perhaps appropriate that we've included Idlewild in our Race and Ethnicity Conference this year because it is the centennial coming up this summer, and there's a variety of celebrations and remembrance events planned. But anyway, it wasn't until after the First World War that the community became very popular, and it grew very quickly. And in time, it would come to dominate, that whole industry of African American resort communities and become one of the most famous in history. Many African Americans, perhaps making virtue out of necessity, right, believed that establishing a resort like this was also important to demonstrating the capabilities of African Americans and punctuating the lies, right, the hypocrisy and the lies of the dominant society that justified segregation through a variety of means. But anyway, with the creation of Idlewild in 1912 and the sale of the first lands there in 1915 and its growth during the interwar period, the result of all of this is a very amazing saga, a striking story that has a lot to teach us about the United States, about the history of Michigan, about race relations in the 20th century in general. As I said, Idlewild has enjoyed some scholarly attention, but my goal in this project is to place it into a wider historical context, to fully understand the historical significance of this community, which, as I said, I'd like to talk with you all about toward the end of our time together today. To understand that historical significance, we have to have a little bit wider lens, especially to begin with. Idlewild's story begins in the early 20th century, which is an era. I have a map here of the Idlewild community as well, and as you can see, there's several nice lakes, as well as a variety of different districts as well. Anyway, come back to that later too. To understand Idlewild, put it in the context, right? In the early 20th century, this is an era of intolerance. It's the era of Jim Crow. It's an era of inequality, an era of intense racism. The words Jim Crow meant a way of life, throughout the United States. At the same time, European empires dominated almost every inch of Africa, right, and exploited its resources and its people. At the same time, in the interwar period, people throughout the world struggled to get those in power to live up to their ideals and promises, right, of democracy and of the rhetoric of self-determination. So confronting segregation in the United States was actually part of a much larger struggle, a global struggle, as many people who spent time at Idlewild fully recognized. But to zoom in on Michigan's history for a moment. Michigan, as a northern state, had never been a slave society, meaning its economy was never based on slave labor. And after the Civil War, of course, it had formalized into law, as did many northern states, specific laws, right, civil rights statutes that forbid discrimination in public spaces. And that law was amended in 1919 to try to make it more powerful, and that in and of itself is actually quite telling that they had to try to amend it to make it work. These laws were notoriously unenforced. Right? The laws were on the books, but it didn't really mean anything if the state and local governments weren't willing to enforce it, which was the case. And that's the case for much of the state's history. Indeed, the term Jim Crow and all that it implies was not only found in the southern states, but in the north as well. Federal lawmakers, state and local lawmakers, they enacted a wide variety of policies to confine African American people's opportunities in the fields of housing in their neighborhoods, and it restricted them in other ways as well. Highway policies, right, as well as housing policies, they were used intentionally. They ravaged African American commercial and residential areas in this time. Governments, they subsidized the movements, primarily, the movement of white families to the suburbs, into which both homesteads and jobs were moving at the same time. And of course, the result was increasing tensions. Tensions grew, of course, during the period of the Great Migration, as tens of thousands of Southern-born African Americans moved into the northern cities, right, in the 1910s and 20s and 30s and 40s and after. Their goal in this Great Migration, of course, like many Southern whites, was to escape rural poverty and to win jobs. Win jobs in the world's most vibrant industrial economies in places like Chicago and Detroit, and all along today's I-75 corridor, with Pontiac and Flint and Saginaw. All of those industrial cities, they offered enormous opportunity, and it was a magnet for people from all over the country, including African Americans. And with that growing population moving north, becoming part of Michigan society, you had both working class African Americans and middle class African Americans. Okay, a very vibrant black middle class, right, became part of Michigan society. And they were entrepreneurs, professionals, retailers, artists. And of course, middle class African Americans, they faced the same housing discrimination, Jim Crow practices, KKK violence, as did poor families. Nearly simultaneous to this growing population of African Americans in Michigan began the history of what we today call white flight. Okay, from cities like Detroit, a growing exodus of employers to cheaper land in the suburbs. And with it came the redlining of real estate practices, denied African Americans equal opportunities for housing. In typical supply and demand fashion, African Americans' homes, they fell in value as whites who were driven by fear of crime, poor schools, their declining home values, and their prejudice, relocated to the burbs. There's an axiom in Michigan's culture, maybe many of you have heard it, and the axiom tells us that if you're poor and white, then you live in a mobile home park, and if you're poor and black, you live in a city ghetto. Right. And while that axiom, right, might be somewhat revealing of Michigan's history of segregation, it's also incomplete, right? Because, right, in reality, even wealthy blacks were prohibited from living in white neighborhoods, right, due to whites' fear of declining property values, right? Even if they weren't personally racist, they were still living in a racist society, and they knew that if they perceived, right, that African Americans moved into their community, that their major investment, their house, would decline in value. And so they wanted to move out, which a lot of people had that perception, and as a result, lots of houses went on the market. Lots more being sold, right? Drove the prices down to be competitive. It made it cheaper for the impoverished, communities to move in, and it was a self-perpetuating philosophy. Again, to understand the history of Idlewild, more context is required. The publication of W.E.B. Du Bois's famous book, The Souls of the Black Folk, 1903. And it is Du Bois. People who read his works would write him letters and ask him, Professor, we're discussing your work in our circle this week, and we would like to know how to say your name properly. And he would reply and say, thank you very much for asking. My name is to be pronounced as two distinct syllables with an audible S, right, or Du Bois. But his famous work, right, one of his most famous works, is called The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903. And it's a wonderful work of American literature. But in this book, he heralds a new, more confrontational approach to civil rights. And it's, of course, in this book that he very wisely argued, very, very astutely argued, that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And in that statement, he's not simply talking about the United States, right? He's often sort of quoted out of context. He's actually talking about the world, right? The fear of the Marxist challenge, or all the other issues, right, that people are concerned with. The real dominant struggle in the 20th century was the ending of racism, which he, wisely analyzes as the cause of many wars and poverty and dislocation around the planet. Well, anyway, in his book, right, Du Bois, the first African American to receive his PhD from Harvard, he condemned the older philosophy of Booker T. Washington, right, the philosophy of accommodation, and Washington's idea that African Americans should confine their ambitions to manual labor. Du Bois called for a more activist approach. And that immediately started to touch off a reaction, right? A reaction that, again, is very apt to what we're talking today, right? The Nashville Banner editorialized his book, and it argued that this book is dangerous for the Negro to read, for it will only excite discontent and fill his imagination with things that do not exist or things that should not bear upon his mind. So even in the reaction to the book, right, we can see the racist times, right, that he was publishing in. But Du Bois, as usual, was much more perspicacious than his critics. And in 1908, just a few years after its publication, after anti-black rioting took place in Springfield, Illinois, Du Bois and a group of African Americans and whites, they would meet in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and they would together, right, they would create America's first national civil rights organization. And that, of course, is the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And this took off, right? The timing was right? Their action, right? It fit with the mood and the atmosphere and the energy of the era. And very quickly, they had a very large national following. By 1914, they had 6,000 members across the United States in 50 cities. Right? Times were changing, right? The more activist approach that Du Bois heralded was coming to be. That new spirit of action also spurred reaction, right, from racists in the United States, of which, of course, there were many. A great example of this, and one that speaks very much directly to why Idlewild was necessary, is the Chicago riot of 1919. And this is a horrific element of Chicago's and America's history. Innumerable lives were damaged and destroyed. Not just property, right, but the entire psychology of a community was brutalized in that city. But the telling thing about this, right, that speaks to what I want to get to later with Idlewild was where it started. And it started at the beach, right there on Lake Michigan, where there was swimming. And of course, the beaches were segregated in Chicago. And there was an African American section, and African Americans were enjoying the beach, in Chicago. And one of the people on the adjacent white beach got it into their head that one or two of the African American swimmers were sort of crossing the boundary in the water and swimming into the white section. And the result is people began to throw stones at African American people swimming in the water. And one person died, struck in the head with a stone and drowned. Anyway, social turmoil was the result, and that's just sort of the beginning of the chaos of this period. It's a period of great change in the 1920s, right? And it seemed to be a time to many people in which long-standing concepts and practices and traditions, like segregation, were being challenged. Okay? The perception of dramatic change was enough to generate a very large, even if it's somewhat short-lived, resurgence, right, of support for an organization that had previously been unknown in the history of states like Michigan. And that's, of course, the KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan. Klan of the 20s was not the Klan of the Reconstruction era in American history. This was a new organization founded in Atlanta, or actually just outside of it, right, when they it was refounded in 1915 when they burned a cross on top of Stone Mountain. They adopted the name and the hooded garb, of the earlier group. And as with the earlier era of Klan activism, and terror, anti-African American sentiments would be a very large part of the new Klan's dogma as well, just as they had been in the first Klan. But the new Klan put a much greater emphasis on what they called 100% Americanism and old-timey morality. In addition to its hatred of African Americans, they expanded their platform of hate to include immigrants, particularly Catholic immigrants, as well as Jewish people and communists, and any group that didn't fit with their very narrow vision of what America was supposed to be. And the Klan in this era of American history, it spread from the South to many other parts of the country, particularly in the 20s. Very fast as well, right? For example, in the early 1920s, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, with more than 500,000 Klansmen, had the heaviest concentration of Klan strength in the United States. Okay? In Michigan, Michigan added another 70,000 Klanspeople, which is probably a conservative number, right, to that. And thus giving the American Midwest, right, those 4 states, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan, over a third, right, of the country's Klan membership. In Michigan, Detroit became, of course, one of the centers of Klan activity in the state, but there were also very active and large Klan organizations in Grand Rapids, Flint, Bay City, Michigan, Jackson, Michigan, Lansing, Michigan, Kalamazoo, Saginaw, Pontiac, Muskegon. I mean, this was a very popular movement throughout the state. All those cities had local chapters. But yes, the Wayne County Provisional Klan in 1921 had 3,000 people. And in 1923, it had gotten so large that they'd induct new members in outdoor cross-burning ceremonies. Right? That's how they got their new recruits in. But it wasn't just in those types of territories, right? It wasn't just in urban centers where we had such a large population. Right? The Midwestern popularity carried into rural areas as well. For example, Newaygo County had one of the largest and densest KKK memberships in the state. And there's a British historian named Craig Fox who has recently written a wonderful book about this. It's a terrifying book in many ways, but it's certainly, the content of it is important to understanding race relations in America. The book is called Everyday Klansfolk, right? White Protestant Life in the KKK in 1920s Michigan. Now, Newaygo County does not have very many African Americans in it, but it is directly bordered on its northern edge by Lake County, where Idlewild is located. And so it's certainly relevant to talk about, the atmosphere where they built Idlewild and how it is surrounded by, places like this where, for example, at the funeral of a Klansman, right, the whole community, right, is out, right, and some of the records, of course, still exist, right. Whoever L. Anderson was of Newaygo County, Michigan, right, had a membership card, which apparently he treasured, right, and they had detailed records, right? Frequent services right up there in Newaygo County. And of course, at the heyday of Idlewild, this is very close by, right? And just even in trying to escape intolerance and bigotry in the cities, even if you go into the wilds of northern Michigan, it's never far away. And so, obviously the Klan didn't last at that level of power for very long. I mean, by the 1920s, it had thoroughly discredited itself and had crises within its internal leadership, and it had been widely condemned in the American press. But still, in the 20s, which is where I'll focus some of my remarks on Idlewild today, this was the atmosphere in Michigan. Speaking of the atmosphere in Michigan, the 20s, a very tense time in race relations. In many ways, it provided glimpses of Michigan's future as well as its past. Racial tension and activism set important precedents. Right? For example, in 1925, the man in the photo here is Dr. Ozzie Sweet. And he was a physician, he was a medical doctor. And initially he was born in Florida, but he'd studied in Europe and taken some of his degrees there, and very good doctor. And ultimately he'd relocated to Michigan, to Detroit. And of course, he had to purchase a home for his family. And as a middle-class person, he wanted to buy a house in a middle-class neighborhood on Detroit's east side. That's where he bought his house. And as he and the family, he and his wife Gladys and their children attempted to move in, a mob of white people from that community, from that neighborhood, descended on his home, gathered around his house to protest his family's arrival in their neighborhood. And the family took shelter in the home. The mob began to throw stones into Dr. Sweet's house. And there was talk in the crowd of setting fire to the house. And of course, the whole family is inside. But yes, the stones are being thrown, and ultimately what happens is that someone inside the house used a firearm to defend the house. They fired into the crowd, ultimately killing one person in the mob and wounding another. And Dr. Sweet, right, and his wife Gladys, they were both arrested and charged with murder right after this. Not self-defense, it was first-degree murder was the charge. And they went to trial. And this became a famous national case that revealed a lot about the tensions in American society in Michigan. And the trial ended, right, the first trial, right, ended when you had a jury that was unable to decide. Okay, the judge in that trial was Frank Murphy. Right? Anyone taking Michigan history will know that Frank Murphy is usually on the side of the underdog, on the side of right and moral justice in history. Before he was governor, he was the judge in that case. But yes, right, it was a divided jury, right, no verdict, so they had to try the case again. And it became even more dramatic on a national scale. And this time, right, the case won the attention and the support of the NAACP, and they had a very good lawyer as well, because the NAACP brought in Clarence Darrow, right, the famous Clarence Darrow, right, who again was a voice, you know, that looking back into history was often on the side of right in this era. And the trial was about race, right, as much as anything else. But Darrow, his task was enormous, because he had to convince an all-white jury, right, that Dr. Sweet and Gladys Sweet, right, were defending their homes and their families. And he did it. You know, and he and Dr. Sweet and Gladys were both acquitted of the crime. Both the defendants were released. And that was an amazing victory, right? It set, of course, a very important precedent, right, under the legal system. Okay? The right that the Sweets, you know, the idea that the Sweets had a right to defend their property and their lives and their families. Yes, it was a victory. Yes, it set an important precedent. Yes, it punctuated change. But it also did not herald a change in the attitudes of many or even a majority of white people in the state of Michigan. African Americans would have to continue to struggle for decades to find equal housing, to be able to move into neighborhoods like this one. That's Dr. Sweet's house, right there in the image. Detroit in the 1940s shows that is true, right, that the struggle had to continue. The arrival of hundreds of thousands of Southerners during the Great Depression, and as we move into the era of the Second World War, hundreds of thousands of Southerners came into particularly Detroit, right, and as I said, Flint and other cities. And they were both black and white, right, and they brought, you know, Southern culture with them into Michigan, changed Michigan forever in innumerable ways, but Southern whites also brought, you know, their racism, right, with them into the city, which merged with Michigan racism. And this intensified long simmering racial tensions. Much of the problem related, once again, to housing, to public space, right, to where people were allowed to be. Now, housing was in very short supply in Detroit because of the rapid population growth. But the housing problem was particularly acute for the African American population because of attempts to confine those working class families to segregated sections. Despite the favorable ruling in the Sweet case, segregated housing practices continued to be enforced. Right? Not only by means of public pressures such as mob attacks, right, but also very restrictive government policies. Right? The government helped to maintain that level of segregation. So, all through the Great Depression, wretchedly inadequate, overcrowding conditions in their housing, and high unemployment because of, again, racially discriminatory practices in places like Ford Motor Company, only added to African Americans' Depression-era, you know, misery and difficulties. When you got the New Deal under President Roosevelt, I mean, they tried to do a little bit. They tried to help alleviate living conditions for a few. But in '42, for example, when they opened the Sojourner Truth Housing Project in a white neighborhood of Detroit, white citizens rioted, right, to drive African Americans out of that community. And in the months ahead, the mayor of Detroit, Edward Jeffries, was under intense pressure from his white voters to resist any effort to move African Americans out of the ghetto. Pressures were exerted to keep anyone from moving out or selling or renting a house to an African American person. In August of 1942, Life magazine did a study on Detroit, and they saw it as a great powder keg. And they were right? They said that Detroit is dynamite, okay, which had been an advertising slogan to draw people to the Motor City and to find jobs there, but Life magazine meant a double meaning for this, right? That because of racial tension, that it was actually dynamite. And it turned out, of course, that Life was correct, and the next year, Detroit erupted into riots, during the middle of the Second World War. And without going into great detail, because I do want to get to Idlewild, the Detroit riot was the product of tension, bigotry, racism, hate, fear, and it boiled over, right, in the city, right, into massive attacks and enormous violence. 34 people were killed. 34 people lost their lives, right, in the riots. Over 400, I think it's 433 people were wounded ultimately in the violence of the riots. Property value destroyed was estimated at about $2 million. And again, despite all the progress that had been made, through the efforts of the NAACP and the Sweet case and so many other things, a long road was yet to go. And the riots certainly punctuated that, right? The world could see it in newspapers. A lot of hate in those images. In the next era again, right, the point is here that all through the era of Idlewild's history, intolerance, despite it being confronted in each of these generations, it remained. Right? So strong it was, right, that it held out throughout the majority of the 20th century, even in the North. Dearborn, right, again on the eastern side of the state, right, Orville Hubbard was the mayor of Dearborn for about 100 years, or so it seemed to people in that section, right, from 42 to 78. Orville Hubbard was the mayor, 36 years. His nickname in the history of Michigan is the Dictator of Dearborn, and it's a well-deserved title. He was the most outspoken segregationist in America north of the segregation line, north of the Mason-Dixon line, excuse me. During his administration, non-whites are aggressively discouraged from moving into the city of Dearborn. His famous campaign in the city was called Keep Dearborn Clean, which was widely understood throughout those 30-some years to mean keep Dearborn white. That's why people voted for him. That was where his power came from. He made his career on being a champion of segregation. Okay. Dearborn in the Hubbard years became a national symbol of Northern segregation. When he left office in 1978, Dearborn had a population of 90,000 people, 20 of whom were African American. Okay. Given those numbers, his career at trying to maintain segregation was successful. In 1948, he led a campaign to defeat a referendum to build a low-income housing project right in Dearborn. And he argued that that would turn Dearborn into a black slum. And he handed out cards, his administration handed out cards to voters telling them to vote no, and the card said, "Keep Negroes out of Dearborn." Of course, he had many critics. And I have an image of him. Right? Here he's being subpoenaed, right, by the Michigan state government, and he's jumping up and down, having a little tantrum on a subpoena. This was a little ritual that Hubbard would perform every time that other aspects of government tried to rein him in, showing his community what he thought, right, of voices trying to pressure him to create an equal society. At one point, the Lyndon Johnson administration actually, the federal government put him on trial for conspiracy to violate human rights. There was a citizen of Dearborn who was rumored to be considering selling his home to an African-American family, and the mayor incited a mob action against that other citizen. So anyway, he was put on trial by the Justice Department and acquitted of all charges. For many years, he was very unabashed in his comments about segregation. He often gave interviews to Southern newspapers, like, for example, the Montgomery Advertiser. And he said, "They can't get in here. We watch it. Every time we hear of a Negro moving, for instance, we had one last year in, we respond quicker than you do to a fire. That's generally known. It's known among our own people, and it's known amongst the Negroes here." And it's very interesting to look at how blatant he is about admitting that to the national press. It was not something to be ashamed of, right, for him in his mind and for many of his political supporters. He was also very open and candid about the tactics that he used, right, to discriminate against people. For example, he once gave another interview where he explained how a government could, without necessarily doing anything illegal, terrorize people, okay, and purge them from communities. And he would say that, well, you know, if an African American family moves into Dearborn, we will offer them police and fire protection that is a little bit too good. Meaning that once an hour all through the night, police and fire trucks would pull up in your driveway, pound on your door, wake you up, because supposedly there'd been a call about some kind of civil disturbance. Right? So you can't sleep. Right? And they do that routinely until people would leave the city. Okay. And of course, if anyone asked, they would just say, well, we're responding to an emergency call. We can't not respond to an emergency call. But anyway, that's just one such tactic. Right? And of course, Hubbard's just an example. He's hardly alone in his views. I also don't want you to leave today, I don't want anyone to leave with the impression that segregation, intimidation, and hate were found only on the eastern side of the state. For example, Grand Rapids, despite the smaller population of African Americans in the city compared to Detroit, fit a very similar pattern. A couple of examples from our own community's history. In 1908, one of the major veterinary colleges in the region was the Grand Rapids Medical College. And the college in that year decided to refuse admission to 2 second-year medical students. Their names are Felix Booker and Wesley McCoy. They had already been in the college for 1 year, and then administrators in the college decided to expel them. Right, despite the fact that they'd successfully completed a year of their education, they expelled them on the basis of their race alone. And Mr. Booker and Mr. McCoy, they took their case to the Grand Rapids, Circuit Court. They argued that it was in clear violation of that 1885 Michigan law, right, arguing that this was not legal. And they won. They won the case. And the court ordered them to be reinstated as students in good standing in the college. And at that point in the city, and especially on the college campus there was an uproar. There are other students in that college right here in the city. They protested the re-entrance of Booker and McCoy. 34 students, right, as Booker and McCoy entered the college to take their seats to resume their classes, 34 students marched out in protests, and they chanted right in the street. Right, in a large protest, they argued, they chanted, right, this is a white man's school, and lynch them if they don't keep out. In the lobby, the white students created an effigy of an African American and carried it into the streets, and then, as the press said, did a lively war dance around it. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but it sounds rather intimidating. But Booker and McCoy, right, were determined to stay, and the college had barred them entrance, would not let them in despite their victory in the first case. The college announced to the community here in Grand Rapids that it had concluded that the presence of 2 African American students irreparably disrupted the decorum of total campus life. The school then hired its own attorneys and went back to the courts. They took it to the Court of Appeals, and they managed at that level to get the ruling overturned. And Booker and McCoy were never allowed to resume their studies at the Grand Rapids Medical College. Okay, that was 1908. It would be 18 years before segregation in Grand Rapids was once again challenged. Okay. This time in 1925 over the issue of a theater. In 1925, a Grand Rapidian named Emmett Bolden, who was African American, who was a dentist, right, by trade. He was a native of Grand Rapids, and he attempted to go to one of the major theaters right in the city, which is actually just kind of down by, used to be down by Ionia and Monroe Avenue, called the Keith, right, the Keith Theater. And the Keith Theater had a policy of segregating its audience. White people were allowed to sit down on the main level, right, and of course African Americans were forced, if they wanted to go to the theater, they had to sit on the upper balcony. And this is an image from inside the Heath. Of course, you're much further back from the stage. You're more segregated from the drama and from the music and from the acoustics and the action in general. Now, Bolden understood that he was challenging the law, right? And he was going to make that struggle. And of course, he was denied entrance. Right? And he refused to accept, the segregated seating. This was a very derogatory thing to be offered seating in that level of the theater. In the colloquial language of Grand Rapids at the time, to reference upper segregated seating in the balcony it's a horrible expression that was widely used in the city. It's ugly. It's a hate-filled term. They called it nigger heavens. If you can believe that. Like I say, a horrible hate-filled term, and he refused to be segregated in that way, and so he also would take his case to the court. Okay. He spent years in the courts. Ultimately, he enlisted the help of the NAACP to get justice and change that theater's practice, which this time in 25, right, same year as Dr. Sweet's case, right, he won a victory. Okay. So there are victories under the law, right? Segregation in the city of Grand Rapids was dealt a blow, but it didn't kill it. It was not over. A quiet pattern of segregation characterized every city, every community, and life in this state as it did everywhere else. Like I say, Jim Crow is not a southern state phenomenon. It was part of life and history in the North as well. Of course, Michigan had already established itself as a premier vacation destination. Famous communities such as Mackinac Island and Manistee and Petoskey and Ludington had become famous. Right? They were characterized, right, like every other part of life in the state, by both overt and more subdued segregation practices. But the message was clear, right, that African Americans were not welcome. We merely have to look at images such as those from the East Grand Rapids community there with the Ferris wheels and so on. We will see only white people. Right? The Mackinac Island advertising and postcard industry, right? You'll never see an African American in the imagery from that era, right, from Mackinac Island. Throughout all the lovely beach communities, right, through all the beauty that Michigan had to offer, segregation tainted it all. Of course, people enjoyed it. Of course, it made Michigan famous. Of course, it created revenue and jobs. But because of segregation, the joy, the economic development opportunities, right, the relaxation, the peace of mind, all that was denied to many Americans on the basis of race. And of course, we should pause and note here, that's a common dynamic. When Americans went on holiday in the period of segregation, they brought their racism with them. Okay, it happened throughout the United States, but of course, it's in the same era that Cuba, right, in particular Havana, a foreign capital of a foreign country, right, that Havana became like the Las Vegas of its day. Right, and many Americans would visit Havana, and there were casinos and beaches and shows and so on. And because American business was the sort of beating heart of Havana's industry, and white Americans, right, when they were on holiday, they didn't want to associate with people with darker skin. The government in Cuba actually banned its own people, if their skin was considered too dark, from going to those beaches and working into those hotels. They did that to cater to the tastes, the racism of people from the northern country. Same thing, right? Paris was a common destination for more affluent Americans. People in France, people in Paris, they loved jazz music in the 20s and 30s. And they would invite in many artists and so on to perform at the hotels and in the bigger theaters. And they would stay in the hotels where they performed. But so would many white Americans, and the white Americans were the majority of the clientele for that hotel. And the white Americans demanded that the Parisian hotel segregate itself. And in order to stay in business with American tourists, right, Paris was segregated because of American racism. Right? And so this is what's happening in Michigan as part of a larger story. And all that takes us to Idlewild. Okay. Lake County was not an island of racial tolerance. And the white developers of Idlewild were not trying to strike a blow for civil rights. Like I say, there was a series of families, right, white Michiganians, right, who were developers. And they detected that there was a market, right, for a middle-class African-American resort community. And they believed that if they created that in the era of segregation, that they could sell land at a profit and make money. Okay. They simultaneously developed another resort not far away near the town of Baldwin that was for whites only. So as I say, I mean, they were not necessarily a civil rights-minded group of developers. But they were correct, right, in their belief that there was a market for something like Idlewild. And of course, it's going to grow quite quickly. As I said, it's the centennial this year. They began plotting out the lands that they'd purchased and then selling them, right, in 1912. They were right about the fact that people would want to come to Michigan and be able to have that experience. The rapid growth of Idlewild between 1917 and 1920 certainly punctuates that. There are lots of important reasons for the growth of Idlewild. For example, many middle-class Americans wanted to buy land there. They felt it was important, again, to demonstrate the capabilities of African Americans. And it was certainly exciting to do that while also being able to take part in a vacation. Some of the first people to buy land in Idlewild and to create their houses and cabins there were community leaders from across the country. For example, Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, okay, in the image here, was an African-American surgeon. Indeed, he was the first surgeon in the United States to operate successfully on the human heart. And that was 1893. From Chicago, right, where he practiced medicine, right, he decided that it would be nice to be able to have a vacation, right, and get out of Chicago, which, as we've seen in the riots of 1919, was characterized by racial tension and bigotry, right, and escape, right, for at least part of the year, right, to a wilderness in northern Michigan. He helped to recruit others. Right. For example, Charles Chestnut, pictured here in a later period of Idlewild's history with his grandson. They're catching fish in Idlewild Lake. Charles Chestnut is a notable African-American novelist and essayist from this time period. He was also often a contributor to the NAACP's magazine, The Crisis, and a close friend of W.E.B. Du Bois. But he was also one of the early people to make Idlewild grow. Another great leader, right, who helped to kick off Idlewild was C.J. Walker, who was frequently known as Madam C.J. Walker. C.J. Walker was the first self-made female millionaire in the United States. Okay, not first made African-American female millionaire, first female self-made millionaire in the United States. And she created her own cosmetics industry and became an industrialist, right, through that industry and was a very powerful figure. And of course, she was one of the ones to buy up some land in Idlewild, right, and would spend much time there. Okay. Others as well, L. Foster was the president of Fisk University, right, another early member in Idlewild. Okay. Together, Dr. Dan and other notables, right, from places like Cleveland and Chicago, they founded the Idlewild Improvement Association. And it's this body of leaders, not the white developers who initially conceived of this idea, it's this body, the IIA, that made Idlewild what it is. Right? It was an African-American body, right? And they conspired together, they worked very closely together, very dedicated together to make Idlewild something that all African-Americans in the country could be proud of. Okay. They worked together to facilitate its growth, to plan its growth at every step of the way. They planned its nightclubs, they planned a post office, barbershops, medical services, grocery stores, a roller rink, filling stations. I mean, all these different parts that eventually came to be Idlewild, right? It was their vision. Okay, filling stations, churches, automobile repair shops, police and fire protection. I mean, they had a sweeping vision of how to create a sustainable and ever-growing African-American resort community. Okay. So yes, Idlewild may have been initially conceived and plotted by white business people, but it's an African-American success, right? They're the ones who made it an icon in American history. In its early days, Idlewild was a playground mostly for the more affluent African Americans of the period. However, it steadily did become more accessible to middle and working class people right over the years. The community's leaders became very, very good at selling Idlewild And they took out advertisements in papers across the country. And they were successful in bringing people here. But they had to educate people about what Idlewild was, what it was supposed to be, why it was special. Okay, so the Chamber of Commerce was created, right, to help facilitate its growth, to get the message out there. Right? And the language that they used and the pamphlets that they handed out and the newspapers that they published in, right, is very telling. For example, right, in this exhilarating summerland, this is from the 20s, all outdoors is your playground. Here's the finest fishing on the continent, swimming, hiking, horseback riding on unusual trails, picnicking in virgin forests, and 100 other recreations. You will find friendliness and hospitality everywhere in this vacation land. So why not treat yourself to a delightful, ideal vacation among the lakes and fragrant pines of western Michigan at America's most distinctive national resort? Quotations there at the end, the extra ones under America's most distinctive national resort are those of the people who published the pamphlet. They're not mine. Right? They knew what they were building. Right? And they were selling not just a vacation, but escape. They were very explicit in what they were doing and why people would want to come there. Idlewild is controlled by Negroes, the Chamber of Commerce told its potential customers. All township officials are of our race. The same applies to our post office and local businesses. Here you can enjoy the vacation of your dream, free from the embarrassing, discriminatory, and petty prejudices which you might encounter elsewhere. If you've never been here before, you will be astonished at the pleasure and relief you will experience, secure in the knowledge that you are wanted. Right? That's what made Idlewild unique. Right? That's what made it special. Right? Was that ability to welcome people. The language used in the advertising demonstrates many things about this time period. Yes, Idlewild was a product of its time. It emerged out of segregation. But it also tells us the reasons for its success, for its very rapidly growing popularity throughout this time period. That message caused people to respond in droves. They came out ultimately in the tens of thousands to participate in this. Idlewild quenched a thirst, right? And that's part of the historical significance that I want to talk about. They responded both for a northern Michigan vacation, which is nice for many reasons. Fireflies, stars, campfires, fishing, hiking. Who wouldn't like that? But Idlewild also was an escape from the intolerance that people lived with every day of their lives, right in the urban centers of the Great Lakes region. In its heyday, Idlewild offered opportunities that were not available, right, in other places. Where else could that youth find a horse to ride in the Great Lakes region? Okay. Idlewild developed its own grocery stores, right? So you didn't have to fear shopping, right? And so everything was welcoming, everything was comfort. Okay. At first, of course, it was quite simple, right? But then the lakes grew up and people brought boats, right? The islands were developed, right? They built a lovely beach. I was there. I went up for a visit to Idlewild about 9 days ago, and it was one of those really nice warm days we had this bizarre March here in Michigan. And I stood on that beach, and it's still lovely. The water's still clear, right? The island is still over there, right? That's Idlewild Lake, right? And then the island as well had more cabins as well as a larger clubhouse and so on. But yeah, here's a beach where it's not crammed in, right, in the middle of you don't have to be, there's not a white beach next to it that people are going to throw rocks at you from, right? I mean, it's entirely for African Americans, okay, and it's beautiful. Okay? But just to relax, you can see in all the pictures of Idlewild, people just enjoying themselves. Right? The earlier pictures, people learn, there's not that many activities, but the joy is genuinely expressed. Okay? A catch in Paradise Lake. I like the fishing clothes, from the period. I don't look that fancy when I go fishing. But canoeing, horseback riding, to be able to play sports, right, to be able to just hang out on the beach, right, these are pleasures that in this era, right, a vacation became an American tradition. Right, to be an American, to experience that American dream as referenced in the advertising literature, that's what people deserved, right? That was part of what it was to be an American, to be equal, right? You deserve that as well. And then by participating, they expressed that. Tens of thousands of visitors. In the late 1950s and the early 1960s, which was largely the heyday of Idlewild, about 25,000 people came there in the summer months, May, June, July, right? And we took it down in August. Labor Day. But yes, 25,000 people, right, migrating up there, and that's an amazing thing. Many people would buy plots of land and they would construct their own cabins, right, and their family would go up there every season. Other people would just rent a cabin for a few days or a week, and then in time also, the community's hotels began to grow up, and you could go just for a few days. But the real draw at the height of its experience, you know, in the late 50s and 60s was the nightlife in Idlewild. It wasn't just the beach and the forest and being able to go fishing and being able to relax and to be comfortable in a way that few other communities in the world offered at that time. But it was the arts, right? It was an entertainment, it was a music culture, right? Anybody who was anybody in African American entertainment played Idlewild on a regular basis. I mean, that was part of what made its draw. So, Sammy Davis Jr., B.B. King, Aretha Franklin, right? Lots of names that you'll recognize, right? Louis Armstrong, James Brown, Four Tops, right? Lots of these people, right? Lots of these artists got their start at Idlewild. The Four Tops got their start at Idlewild. I mean, they really knew how to pack in the crowds, right? The people who organized all of this entertainment, right? And they did showcase some of the finest entertainers of their generation. Okay. Well, anyway, there's an interview that was done with one of the dancers at Idlewild. Right? Her name was Lottie the Body Graves, and she finally remembered Idlewild as the Black Atlantic City, the boardwalk, Las Vegas. Lottie the Body said it was like heaven. Right, and a lot of people described it that way. And in fact, it became known around the country as Black Eden. Right, and that's how different it was. Right? It was like going to heaven. And it's just Lake County, Michigan. But to that community in that time in history, right, it was like heaven. Okay. The Paradise Club was the premier venue. Its Fiesta Room, above all else, right, was where everyone wanted to go to experience the best shows. Okay, lots of them were well-known performers, and others not as well-known. Okay, but it was spectacle, right? As any Greek dramatist knows, right, there's 6 crucial components, right, to drama: plot, theme, character, language, rhythm, and spectacle. And they had the spectacle. Right, they had the theme, right? They had the significance of it on display, right? And it was an amazing sight to behold, right? The dancers, the stand-up comics, the musicians, they did tap, right? They did everything, and you could have your choice of what you wanted. Of course, many performers liked to visit Idlewild because not only did you get work and be able to practice your art and make your wage, but then you were also in Idlewild, which was lovely, during the day. This group here is musicians, but that's Louis Armstrong. They're in the boat there in Lake Idlewild. In the off-season, the artists and performers of the Idlewild, group, they went on tour around the country, and this is called the Idlewild Revue, right? And it's Arthur Braggs, right, who put this together. But they traveled around the country, and they brought this art to places throughout the United States as well as Canada and Mexico, right? And they stimulated other artists, and they encouraged other people, right, with their art. And the Idlewild sound worked its way into the musical culture of the United States. Eventually, much of the Idlewild sound became the Motown sound, and the two merged with groups like the Four Tops. They reached a much wider audience, right, through the Idlewild Revue. Again, it was good work and created a lot of employment, but also the opportunity to develop art. At first, the experience in Idlewild was quite rustic. The first generations of people to stay at Idlewild, right, many of them who didn't own cabins, you could rent a cabin. There was a series of cabins made on the island in Paradise, in Idlewild Lake. There's 2 major lakes. There's Idlewild Lake and Paradise Lake. And on the island, right, in Idlewild Lake, right, there's a row of cabins which were affectionately called the dog houses, right, by people who went there, largely because they looked like really big dog houses. There's 1 door and 1 window and a couple of bunks. That was not uncommon in resort communities across the state at that time. But yes, it was rustic accommodation. But of course, that's just something you had to put up with. The point was not to be inside anyway. The point was to be outside. Swimming, fishing, canoeing, horseback riding, hiking, all the wonderful things that people like to do. And we have some wonderful primary sources right from this time, people who wrote about their experiences. In 1928, a young man named Harry Solomon, who eventually moved to Idlewild permanently, he writes about his first experience there. He was 12 years old. He says, in August of 1928, at the age of 12, I, my father, mother, sisters, and brother made the trip to Idlewild. I remember it took 24 hours to get there from Detroit in a Model T Ford after many flat tires. I remember my sister becoming car sick from the trip. I remember that Idlewild was rugged, natural, and beautiful with dirt roads, trails, and very few modern conveniences. There were no electric lights, no electric water pumps. There were kerosene lamps, no inside toilet facilities. I saw for the first time in my life snakes, porcupine, deer, bear, rabbit, and many kinds of birds in their natural habitat. I saw my father shave by the light of the sun for the first time. We spent 2 very beautiful weeks in a cottage. We had many camp-type meals. This was my first experience of what a vacation was like. It wasn't always rustic, right? It developed, right? You got hotels, the nightclubs, the art and music culture that we were just talking about. And they brought in more people to share this experience. Sharing Idlewild with America, with African Americans, was an important part of the community's developers' vision. Right? So they brought in what they called excursion groups. They used buses to bring in large groups of people from major cities throughout the Midwest, even just for a day. Right? They'd bring in dozens and dozens of people, right, to go swimming on that beach, right, to hear a quick show, and then back on the bus. But the idea became Idlewild was something for everyone, the right to a vacation, the right to a day out, the right to an escape from bigotry and relaxation was an American experience. Okay. But yes, there were lots of activities that grew up around Idlewild. Not everybody wanted to go to a floor show every night. And so there were card games, there were more traditional dances, there were flower and garden shows, became a huge competition amongst the regulars at Idlewild. And every year they'd have a competition who could create the best garden. There were fashion shows. Of course, there were regular parades and celebrations, right, all through the summer holidays. There's lots of interesting 4th of July art, right, with the community at Idlewild's clubhouse, with the American flag and celebrating, their country. In terms of fascinating primary sources, Carleen Gill, pictured here, was what was called a fiesta doll, right, in the heyday of Idlewild, and she was a dancer. Right, and she participated in this unique culture, and she has a description. Right, she gave an oral interview a few years ago where she describes this, and she talks about when she was a young woman. Right, one of her friends was an employee at Idlewild, created opportunities of employment for a lot of people as well. Anyway, she says one day a friend, a dancer at the Paradise Club in Idlewild, told me about a job opportunity. I'd never been to see Idlewild. Right, but I'd been to see the Idlewild Revue, traveling show in Detroit. I went and tried out. She talks about how she went and asked her mother if it would be okay, and her mother was very supportive. Arthur Braggs, the owner of the Paradise Club, accepted me. We went to Idlewild to rehearse in early summer. People from New York came to fit us for costumes, $5,000 and up for one girl for 3 events. Right, the beginning act, the middle act, and the finale. A month before Idlewild opened, cooks, waitresses, band acts, middle act, final act, showgirls, doormen came. Everything was first class, she says. White tablecloths, best of steaks. At the time, it gave you a sense of belonging. Mr. Braggs got cabins for us and paid a decent salary. Idlewild was fabulous, like New York or Paris. It was where the top-of-the-line black entertainers went. The shows were directed and produced by black people, and the upper-class black people went there because they couldn't go to resorts like those in Florida. I was one of 4 showgirls or prancers. Then, maybe you'd have a comedian and tap dancers. After Labor Day, the show closed. Then we went on the road in the bus. She talks about bringing down the show, and this very interesting Idlewild practice every season where the last show, the people who danced would swap costumes with the musicians, and the musicians would have to dance, and the dancers would play the instruments, and how everyone thought that that was so hilarious. And you could just tell that they knew how to have fun up there. Anyway, then she says, then we went on the Idlewild Revue show on the bus, Kansas City, New York, Chicago, New Jersey, Boston, Oklahoma, Canada. I remember traveling to nightclubs. When doing a review around the country, she says we couldn't go in the front door. We couldn't go in to the audience. So this takes us to the idea of Idlewild's historical significance. Obviously, Idlewild was fun. Okay? And perhaps one of the principal reasons for its existence was that so many people could enjoy themselves. But in this context, it wasn't just fun. Joy in this context is profound. Not only did this community offer safe haven in a world fraught with intolerance and hate and violence, it simultaneously provided other things that could not really be found easily in America, right? Such as emotional and physical rejuvenation, right? Constant stress, right? In your everyday life, right? Discrimination, bigotry in the workplace, in the school system, in the neighborhoods, right? In Idlewild, people could escape that culture, right? And imagine being able to escape, right, that environment of tension, what that could do, right? That could allow you to carry on more easily for the next year, right? So it's not just physical, but it's also emotional. It's peace. It's not just peace and quiet and yes, fresh air and birds singing, but it's a type of peace that only Idlewild could provide. Moreover, the idea of being able to have a vacation had, by this point in America's history, certainly in the 20s and 30s, and in the 40s and 50s, during Idlewild's heyday, a vacation became intrinsic to the American identity. Okay? It became a right and a privilege that all working Americans, right, should have access to. A central element. A vacation had become a central element of a life that was lived in the spirit of the American dream. And if you didn't have a vacation, right, then you weren't really an American. At Idlewild, African Americans, they were able to stake their claim to that dream and to that right. Any map of the community, like the one that I had up earlier and forgot to mention, any map of the community demonstrates the people of Idlewild's commitment to that American ideology and values. You drive around Idlewild today, you see streets that are named Jefferson, Payne, Adams, Wilberforce, Du Bois Avenue, Miracle Street, Joy Street, Unity Street, Paradise Boulevard. Right? Idlewild represents people's American identity. Right? It represents the fact that everyone should be able to have that experience. So, to say that fun and relaxation were the only reasons for Idlewild would be distortive. It would be too reductive. Many people who lived, worked, and vacationed at Idlewild, they understood that that community was more than may have initially met the eye. It was symbolic. It was symbolic in many ways. Equality, capabilities of future African Americans, right? It was a symbol of all of that. It was a symbol that directly confronted the lies about African American limitations and inferiority that are widely perpetuated by the scientific racism of that era, by the eugenics movement, right? Idlewild confronted all of the lies, right, by those racist movements. Right? Everything that said African Americans were less, Idlewild helped to debunk that. Some of those who lived and visited Idlewild, right, they had different ideas about exactly how Idlewild was significant. For example, many people in Idlewild in the 20s were members of Marcus Garvey's UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Mr. Garvey himself visited Idlewild in the era, right? And ultimately, the people in Idlewild, they built one of 16 UNIA halls in the state. And it's still there, the structure. It's no longer in use. But the hall is still there. Okay? Indeed, for people in the UNIA, right, following Garvey's vision, right, of civil rights action. They would see Idlewild as a demonstration of African success and African American beauty. One reason to be proud of one's black identity. And it was an opportunity for black business people. Okay? Garveyism was very popular, especially in the 20s and 30s. For those people who went to Idlewild and were more inclined to support the vision of the NAACP and follow Dr. Du Bois's vision, Du Bois himself was very vocal on Idlewild and would write about it in his magazine, The Crisis, of which he was also the editor. And he says, for sheer physical beauty, he's very poetic, Dr. Du Bois, for sheen of water and golden air, for nobleness of tree and flower and of shrub, of shining river and song of bird and the low moving whisper of sun, moon, and star. It is the beautifulest stretch that I have seen for 20 years. And then add to that fellowship, sweet, strong women and keen-witted men from Canada and Texas, California and New York, Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois, all sons and great-grandchildren of Ethiopia, all with the wide leisure of rest and play. Can you imagine a more marvelous thing than Idlewild? Okay. His vision of Idlewild, right, from the NAACP viewpoint, Idlewild's existence stressed the equality of black and white Americans. It punctuated the hypocrisy and the reasons usually given to maintain Jim Crow laws and practices across the country. Still others believed in the older ideology of Booker T. Washington and their accommodation philosophy with segregation. But really it's the first two that are the most popular movements, right, amongst the people who visited and worked in Idlewild. I like this image here. That is W.E.B. Du Bois in Idlewild, right, with a friend of his. He owned land there briefly, which he bought from Dr. Dan, the heart surgeon from Chicago, right, and was a regular visitor there, right, in the 20s and 30s. So this is the cultural legacy of Idlewild, right? It means more to people than just a fishing trip or a day at the beach. Okay? The cultural legacy of Idlewild is joy in creation as resistance and social change. Okay? Those things aren't necessarily different. Sometimes they're the same. Okay? Joy in creation as resistance and social change. Idlewild meant so much to so many different people. It meant political meetings. Right? It meant professional opportunities, right? To develop a business, right? To be on a city council. Right? It meant organizational experience, right? And all of those things. It meant leadership roles. It meant government experience. It created so many jobs. It allowed so many artists and musicians and singers to practice their gifts and hone their skills. Okay? And all of that has a ripple effect throughout history. Okay? For example, one of my favorite groups from the Motown sound is the Four Tops. Okay? The Four Tops, they got their start playing the Paradise Club in Idlewild and on tour, right, with the revue, right, with the Idlewild Revue. And they produced songs of love and happiness and heartbreak in a style that eventually became one of the archetypes of the Motown sound. You know, the rhythms of the Motown sound, the topics of the Motown sound, the lyrics of the Motown sound. Their big hits right under the Motown labels, such as Baby, I Need Your Lovin', and I Can't Help Myself, and Reach Out. You know, those were Idlewild songs, and those were Idlewild, lyrics and Idlewild rhythms and Idlewild themes. And that became part of the Motown sound. Okay? And with Motown, right, a lot of those artists who went big in Motown, right, they had experience playing Idlewild. Okay, so the connection between the two has to be recognized. Okay, Motown and everything that those artists did changed the musical landscape of America forever. Right? In the 60s, because of Motown, right, white teenagers started to dance to the music of black artists. Right? Gordy, right, the Berry Gordy, right, one of the leaders of Motown would explain, right? He said, when I went to white radio stations to get records played, they would laugh at me. They thought I was trying to bring black music to white people, to cross over. And I said, wait a minute. It's not really black music. It's music by black stars. I refuse to be categorized. They called my music all kinds of stuff, rhythm and blues, soul, and I said, look, this music is pop. Pop means popular. If you sell 1 million records, you're popular. The slogan of Motown became, right, the sound of young America. right? And he was right. I mean, this music, right, that came out of Idlewild that merged with the Motown experience, it did have reverberating effects throughout society, right? Another wonderful sociologist and historian is Dr. Cornel West from Princeton University. And he argues that the genius of Berry Gordy is that he perceived a vacuum in the musical culture of the nation. And he was able to convince young brothers and sisters like me on the black side of town that this was my music. And at the same time, he was able to convince white brothers and sisters on the other side of town who were listening to the Beach Boys that Motown was their music too. Okay? In this way, the music that came out of this era, it was a step, it was another step towards at least mental desegregation. Right? Now the experience of one community was the experience of another community, and they shared that. Right? It became a hallmark of a generation. Right? And there's lots of ways to see this, but some of you in the crowd may remember, well, that's the Four Tops later on, right? They were quite young in that picture. But some of you also might remember this movie called The Big Chill. Okay, that's a little bit dated now, but it's one of those great coming of age, dealing with adulthood movies in the 80s, and it's about that generation that grew up with the Motown sound. And it's a movie, look at their faces, it's a movie about white yuppies. Okay, but the soundtrack to The Big Chill is the Motown soundtrack. That was the soundtrack of their lives, their experiences. Right? As I say, right, it's a step towards mental desegregation. So, what happened to Idlewild? Okay. What happened to civil rights, started to win some victories in the 1960s through a lot of people's struggle. Right? Idlewild's success and popularity would not last forever after this. The Public Accommodations Act in '64 was a big one, but then other civil rights legislation as well. Many African Americans began to patronize white establishments that had previously barred them. To do otherwise would mean that all those people, both black and white, who had risked everything, including their lives, to produce real lasting social change in America, had done so in vain. As the popularity of separate but equal faded into the past, the growing interest, right, and the resulting success of the integration movement changed Idlewild's history. Okay? This allowed African Americans to enjoy the same wider-ranging choice of vacation spots as other Americans, okay, as white Americans. At the same time that this was happening, a lot of the founding leaders in Idlewild either retired or passed away, and the younger generation had this huge crisis to deal with in terms of people choosing other places, and at the same time, they didn't have as much experience as the generation that had, all seemed to retire and pass away, just in advance of this legislation. So anyway, it made it difficult for the next generation to maintain their customer base. Right? People were hungry to see other vacation spots. And, well, Lake County, Michigan is nice. So are the Rocky Mountains. So is Florida. Right? And so is so many other places. And people wanted to see those too. Right? And many people chose to visit the other parts of this country rather than Idlewild every single year. And as a result, Idlewild fell into decline. And some of the quintessential buildings, they don't look much today. This is I took this picture, like I said, a little over a week ago, and that's the Flamingo Club, right? That's the Fiesta Room. It's, there's a historical marker around it, as there are so many in the Idlewild communities, but it's no longer a focal point of American entertainment culture. Right? And anyway, change across the country, change across the world by the 60s, decolonization at the same time as civil rights legislation in America, it changed Idlewild forever. But I just want to end toward this note, is that Idlewild is still here. Okay? It's still a community. Right? It's still a vacation spot. According to the last census, there's about 780 some people who live in Idlewild year-round. But still, during the summer months, during the season, as they still call it, right, that number swells to well over 5,000. Right? People still own cabins up there. It's still primarily an African-American community, though there is a population of white people as well, right, who live and vacation in Idlewild. They have music festivals to this day. It's also a retirement community, right, as well, and there's several different businesses there that that make it lovely. Again, some other images, right? That's the entrance, right? It is a historic community. There is a cultural center there that you should visit during the season, you know, when it's open. And if you're ever up that way, if you're going to Baldwin or you're going canoeing in the Pere Marquette or something, stop off in Idlewild and visit that museum and cultural center. It's worth your time. But yeah, I mean, this is Paradise Lake, right? There's a lovely park, right? There's that beach that we saw in the period photos. Historical markers are interestingly done. That's the clarity of the water in the lake, right? It's just gorgeous, and a lot of fun as well. But anyway, for more information on Idlewild's seasonal events, right, I would have you go to the this website here for the Idlewild African American Chamber of Commerce, right? And they have a calendar there of upcoming events, and there's a contact information for the people who maintain the site, and they'd be happy to tell you more about everything that's going on this year for the centennial. Like I said, it's interesting work. Okay. Idlewild's still here, right? And the music festival and the cultures that they have every year are still a part of that rich tapestry of Michigan's history and modern society too. So I wanted to see if there's any questions and also to see this issue of historical significance, right? Why does Idlewild matter? I mean, I had some ideas, but I'm also curious about what ideas you have. And we're being...
Got a microphone here if you've
Excellent.
got a question.
Excellent. Hold on, we got to get the mic. Thank you.
Like, during the heyday, like, was it relatively closed off to potential white visitors too, or was it accommodating for white people who wanted to experience that too?
Well, no, it was, and actually in some of the historical photographs that I found, and there's lots of rich historical photos, including in the book there, the Black Eden, the Idlewild community. It's a collection of period photos, and there are white people in the photos. Some of them I had in the show here had white Idlewilders, as they were called. So no, it was not segregated. I mean, it was primarily African American, you know, in terms of ownership and businesses and participants and so on. But that's because of the nature of the world at the time. Some of the bands, you know, had white musicians as well as African American musicians, and they would relax on the beach during the, you know, together during the day, and then play the Paradise Room at night. Yeah.
Also, like you talked about the excursion groups.
Yeah.
Like, and they would take the buses from like cities around Michigan or just the country, or and who would organize that? Like, was it people from Idlewild or?
Yeah, it was people who ran the Idlewild Clubhouse, and then eventually the Paradise Room would do it as well, and then some of the hotels would do that, because a lot of people, you know, especially in the excursion groups were for people of less means. You know, they couldn't afford to rent a cabin for a week, or but they might be able to rent a hotel room for a couple of days, and they didn't necessarily own a car. Right, and so this helped more people from different socioeconomic backgrounds make it to Idlewild and participate. And so yes, Idlewild companies that would plan these buses, they would take out ads, you know, in newspapers. If you want to go to Idlewild, be at this place and time, you buy a ticket on the bus, take you up this day, take you back that day. And sort of an all-inclusive package, or at least transportation and a room and some board. Yeah.
Did any white segregations or KKK members try to disband it?
Not that I was able to find, right? And despite the large population of KKK people in neighboring Newaygo County, I've never seen anything to document an attack. I'd be interested to learn more about that. I imagine that it would have been, if I were an African American traveling through Newaygo County to Lake County, right? I imagine that would have been tense. Okay, I mean, knowing the popularity of the Klan and how they controlled the local government and so on in so many parts of the country, especially when, like the author said, when you get a flat tire, when you're broken down. So I imagine that's part of the experience, but I've never read about actual confrontations. The Klan was not always overt. I mean, it became, in many communities, its popularity led it to become more of a social organization, like the Elks Club or something. Some of the Klan groups are very active in a campaign of hate and terror, and others less so. But I can't say that it did ever happen. I can't say it did neither.
I'm curious, where was the white resort in Baldwin located? Was that the Big Star Lake area, or was it Wolf Lake, or particular anywhere?
It was towards the Wolf Lake, right about 4 miles outside of Baldwin.
Okay.
You know, I don't know that it ever had a particular name in that era, right? But it was designed as a series of plots of land that could be sold to people, and it was designed to be sold to only white people, whereas Idlewild was for African Americans.
Great story, and you told it beautifully. Thank you. I'm curious about another side of the story, maybe. And I'm not sure how much you found in your research, but it's a question of access. It's interesting when you talked about so many different groups of people seeing these positive aspects of Idlewild, from the followers of Marcus Garvey all the way to people who would identify with Booker T. Washington. But is there a class issue here? The talented 10th showing up in this beautiful spot in Michigan and vacationing, and most African Americans maybe not being able to experience that? Or was there an attempt to reach out across social class lines? Is that an issue?
I think that, of course, initially it was conceived of as a middle-class African-American resort. And I think that for at least the first generation of Idlewilders, that was their social background. During the Depression, of course, growth was curtailed. Right? But after World War II, right, there were serious efforts made to expand it, to make it accessible to the widest possible number of people. And that's why we get into excursion groups. I think the clientele was always largely, middle class, right? It was heavier concentrated in the middle class than working class, but working class people did have access to it as well. Just kind of as an addendum to that, in terms of the employment opportunities that it created, it created employment opportunities for working class African Americans as well as middle class African Americans. And I think Carleen Gill is a good example of that. So a lot of people's lives were impacted by it. But yes, I mean, especially in the early period, it was largely a middle-class experience to be an Idlewilder. I've not yet gotten the question I anticipated.
You want to answer it anyway?
I was wondering if someone would ask me where the name Idlewild comes from. And the answer is, I don't know. And I've looked, but it's there's an, before JFK Airport was JFK, it was Idlewild Airport. There's a place that in the novel, Anne of Green Gables, that is called Idlewild's a quiet meeting place, which the novel predates Idlewild by a few years, but I can't find any direct reason for why it was called Idlewild. But it became a joke, or it became a common understanding, or a common joke, right, for the Idlewilders, that Idlewild is a place where men can be idle and women can be wild. Okay, and so for the people of Idlewild, I mean, that's always been sort of their explanation for where that came from. Yeah. Well, anyway, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for your attention, and for the conference for inviting me.